Okay, good morning. How's everyone? All right, so thank you all for coming out this morning. Autumn, feel like the first autumn day. Nice breeze for new directions in the study of slavery and its afterlives. Before we kind of get into discussion and the Q&A, I want to give a few shout outs. Thank a number of folks and institutions. The history department for the generous support, especially Emilio Corey, kind of believed in this vision as we articulated it. The Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Social Sciences Division, and the Neubauer Family Assistant Professors Program for the generous financial support. I want to thank my colleagues, John Levy, who was clearly at the forefront the last few days and writing blurbs to publicize the event. And doing so much more. Brodwyn Fischer, who is on the panel this morning, and my colleague, Amy Drew Stanley, who can't be with us today.
The term, the afterlife of slavery, that's at least my sense of this, and maybe you all have a different genealogy, that's Saidiya Hartman's term that she first uses in Lose Your Mother, which is her sort of semi-autobiographical discussion of her own experience as an African-American woman going back to Ghana. And I think that it's a profound, it's important as we think about what the afterlives of slavery are to kind of recognize the genealogy of the term, because for her it's about the kind of clash between her identity as a scholar and her identity as an African-American woman, right? And the really messy pain of that clash, and her efforts to make sense of that. And I think that that's something I always want to kind of hold on to, as the term, the afterlife of slavery, is become quite ubiquitous for many of us who are working on either the histories of slavery or the histories of race in the 19th and 20th centuries.
I have to say that despite this richness of influence, that my experiences reflect on them somewhat different. I first knew slaves as kinfolk. My Louisiana-born grandmother's grandparents, to be more precise. And I think that knowing something of the texture of those kin in some ways helped to shield me from an assault that lurked in the sketch of slaves' lives in the United States that appeared in 3 editions, perhaps later, in a book published by the University of Chicago Press, 1959 edition, 1967 edition, which may be the one that I first encountered, and then in a 3rd edition in 1976. The author was Stanley Elkins, and his book was Slavery, a Problem in American Institutional and Intellectual Life. When the sort of full weight of Elkins' gendered caricature of the slave as an isolated, antisocial male, incapable of political imagination, crescendoed in an illustration that also, from my vantage point, as an undergraduate recently arrived in Massachusetts to study in college, it also, from the state of Tennessee, and having grown up in Alabama, Arkansas, and Texas, it was also included an insult to my favorite regional cuisine. When Elkins wrote that the male slave in the United States could have, unlike the male slave in the United States, the slave in Latin America could have a family life not limited to catfish and watermelon. So I felt like, in some ways, knowing the richer texture of slaves' lives provided a safe space for me to think through those issues. An interest in the study of political consciousness that slaves brought to emancipation, the politics that they made to survive slavery and to remake emancipation, stayed with me.
The notion of informality as a form of governance, right, as part of liberalism, as something that liberalism needs in order to function, as part of what we understand as a modern state, as something that that modern state needs and uses in order to function in the way that it does. So I started thinking sort of theoretically about that and decided that I wanted to write a book about how it is that these systems grew together. That is, how informality and liberalism and the kinds of things that we associate with liberalism, political liberalism, how those things sort of came together in a certain kind of space. It's not at all metaphorical to think about favelas and to think about informality as an afterlife of slavery. And one of the reasons for that is that, I mean, it's common in Brazil to think of the critical feature of slavery as the fact that people are property, right? And that's a theme that's so important in all of our work and all of these ways of thinking. But that conception depends on an idea of property that mystifies the relationship between law and politics, right? And so if we think of, well, if somebody's property, that's just a definite thing, it's defined by law, it's not a political question, it's a question of, you know, that person is assigned as being property or that thing is assigned as being property, and it gives it a kind of cleanliness that, of course, we all know it doesn't have in real life. And particularly in Brazil, the idea that property is not political is a ridiculous idea. Like, there's no property that anybody can buy where there's a clean title, even today. You know, the idea that property can somehow be demystified, stripped of its political quality, is really quite obviously a lie there, in a way that in some places we're better at telling ourselves that that's not a lie. And that was especially true with slave property, because Brazil was the destination for somewhere around 40% of all the people that were exported from Africa. And in the 19th century, between 1831 and the early 1850s, about 700,000 of those people were brought to Brazil illegally. That is, by the laws of the Brazilian nation, those people were illegally enslaved. They were brought after the slave trade had been banned. So this means that precisely during the years that Brazil is growing as an independent state, as an empire first, and then later supposedly as a republican state, it is a state that is supporting the illegal enslavement by its own laws of 700,000 people and all of their descendants. So the idea that these people were legal property is a fiction, a complete fiction, even more than it is in other places. What informality is in a country like Brazil is the compromise of a bunch of people whose biggest objection to abolition was not necessarily the end of property, it was the end of that personalistic system of power. And so they managed to continue that, even though they had constitutions and laws that said that it wasn't that kind of country. But through a system where the majority of people work informally, the majority of people live informally, everything that you want to get happens through informal things, that's an afterlife of slavery.
What I was schooled in very quickly at graduate school was how important the transformation of slave history was to supplying a grammar that all historians, at least all US historians and historians within the Western Hemisphere, but really in some ways all historians, had to reckon with and start to change their categories. I initially came up as somebody who saw himself as a cultural historian. There was no way to think about the methodology of how to identify sources in relation to African American cultural history, how to understand the formation of African American cultural history, how to think about some of the key mechanisms and devices that characterize that, how to understand the distinction between kind of organic versus syncretic notions of culture. You couldn't do that without diving deeply into the grammar and really the sort of semantics, the rules that were supplied by the reworking of how people thought about culture through the study of slavery. And that was the first and in some ways the best lesson for me, that even though I did not move into this period before in the United States, 1865, that I had to refer to it conceptually and methodologically in order to understand what it was that I might do and what it was that I wanted to do. So that was significant too. But I think something else that I wound up thinking about and attempted to write in relation to the work that I did on Chicago and continue to do on Chicago was the way in which also slavery constituted a problem in terms of people thinking that sometimes it was a topic that people would just as soon not engage with, turn away from, find a way to repress, or maybe even more precisely to retire to the past. So this notion of thinking about afterlives of slavery, it's not as if this emerged in a vacuum. I think many, many people, and not just only those in majority communities bent on maintaining domination, but African Americans themselves have had concerns, difficulties, problems with reckoning with slavery?
I think some of my initial concerns were actually through literature and the kinds of empathy I think that fiction can evoke in readers. And that empathy for me was compounded, I think, by the understanding that that enslaved people were my ancestors as well. And so I remember reading as a child with my mom the Addie series in the American Girl series. Yeah, some nods of recognition. So, yeah, and you know, that series, unfortunately to this day, is has very fixed, I think, and limited understandings of American and girl as their concepts. But that aside, I remember reading the scene where Addie is forced to eat the tobacco worms that she missed, right? And just crying and crying and crying. And I would ask my mom why, why? You know, it didn't make sense to me. But as I've been reflecting on this question, I returned to that moment of reading, that early moment of reading. And it sort of was a kind of a topic of fiction that was brought into the household and sort of stayed. So maybe less discussed as often as a family history explicitly because of some of the reasons that have been mentioned here, but there was space for it in fiction. I'm concerned with what happens to, in terms of Afterlives, someone like Solitude, who was a woman in Guadeloupe who was captured and imprisoned for living as a Maroon and fighting as a Maroon, but is understood to have been 9 months pregnant at that time. And so her sort of imminent labor is something that I think has made her very easy to kind of hold on to as a figure in Guadeloupe. And so today she's kind of celebrated as an ancestor, even though it's unclear what happened to her child. So they waited until she gave birth before punishing her. And the archive is very slippery on this, and fictional works have kind of come in to amplify her story. But people today think of her as kind of a mother figure. Everyone can be a sister of solitude, and so there's kind of ample relation there. But I'm in that case asking, what does it mean for a Maroon woman to be designated a national hero by the state of a French dom-tom, right? Can she give birth to a nation state in that way? Can she give birth to something so entrenched in the state?
There was something, Vince, you said at the beginning. You talked about the unacknowledged traditions. And so the question is, what are those traditions? And one thing that sort of emerged here is what we learned from our parents, kinfolk, their institutional traditions. The idea that you thought you were taking a class with Julie's student. I assume. Vince and Jennifer as students of a PhD program at Duke University. After John Hope Franklin had retired at that point, but had left from Chicago to come to Duke University. And so what we see there is a kind of institutional and intergenerational guidance, right? The traditions that we want to acknowledge, that we need not call the Black radical tradition. It could be some other kind of tradition. There are many traditions. And so I think it was just important to kind of acknowledge them. And then you both did something that was really interesting. You sort of perfected the shout out. Right? So we talk about the afterlives and the afterlife of slavery, but then you name Saidiya Hartman. So we acknowledge those traditions by way of citational practices in calling out the names of folks who sort of get decoupled from the concept. And then the concept becomes free-floating. And it's not really clear who came up with the formulation. So that was just important that you did what you did, Jennifer. And then also what you did yesterday, Vince, in shouting out another scholar in the room, right? And allowing him to talk about his work and to see your work in conversation. So that's the ways in which we can acknowledge those traditions that propel our work on slavery.
What, for me, the afterlife of slavery is unpacking the sometimes amorphous ways in which the grammar of American life is embedded in the violences and the power dynamics that are set in motion by slavery, and that we find everywhere from textbooks that either use the word darky or imply the word darky, or from institutional locations where and Vince and I have had a chance to talk about this a couple times this past year, around the moment of the publication of Common Wind, that there was something institutionally that happened at Duke University between like 1985 and 1994, in which there were a group of us who were gathered for whatever reasons, all of whom were interested in the grammar of the history of slavery, whether or not we were all scholars of slavery. There were many people there who were not, but who were deeply influenced by the archival practices. And I think we were all, in ways that I can speak in hindsight, I can say we were all really trying to understand what an afterlife of slavery might look like, both institutionally as academics, but also as politically engaged citizens, right?
And it goes to what I think is a larger issue, and slightly tangential, but I think relevant to something that Adam said earlier, which is the difficulty of actually just observing even the historical documents that we do have, right? Given the frameworks and the terms that we use to understand things, sometimes it becomes very difficult to even see women maroons. It becomes very difficult to even see how accounting attaches itself to the bodies of women first. It becomes very difficult to even see soldiers and slaves talking about their experiences as warfare, because we always already know categorically that those women don't count, that these women don't count, that this is an insurgency, it's a revolt, it's a riot, and not a war. And one of the things that I find is, George Orwell said, to see what is in front of one's nose takes constant struggle. I find that's also the work of the historian, to even see the sources that we do have, never mind all their limitations, takes a constant struggle of just, in some ways, bracketing and laying aside a lot of the received traditions that we're working in and saying, okay, what am I seeing here? What kind of framework do I need to actually see what's in front of my face?